Thank you, Dan. There was a couple handouts at the back there. There's kind of the normal half-page one and a little booklet one, and then there was a sheet, a double-sided sheet, said the New Testament epistles on it. You're going to need both of those. If you didn't get one, just throw your hand up, and Rick can find you. We'll come to the chart there in a minute, but you'll start with the half handout there. So we are getting close to finishing our series here. We have one more next week, and that'll be on Revelation. And then on March 19th, so 2 weeks from this morning, we have a special guest with us, Tim Strickland. And for those who are a part of the Barnabas program, you met Tim end of February there. He taught the course over in Mount Forest. So he's going to be with us, and he is the leadership director for Feb Central region. So of our denomination, the region of Ontario and English-speaking Quebec, about 275 churches. Tim oversees leadership development in those churches. He's been a big help to me and to our leadership and just working through some things at a church level. So he's going to be here, and he's going to do Sunday school in 2 weeks. I said, tell us what's happening in Feb Central. Tell us what God is doing around the region. And so I encourage you to be here because God's moving and working in our nation and in our province. And so I'm excited to hear what Tim's going to share with us. And then he's also going to preach in the morning service. So that's 2 weeks from this morning. So I encourage you to be here. It's going to be a great morning together. We come this morning to, as Dan said, the epistles. The epistles. Now these books of the Bible are next to the Gospels, probably the most well-known. When it comes to doing our devotions, when it comes to Bible study, this is kind of where we like to go because there are letters written to the church, and we are the church. And so when we read them, it's very applicable, and it's easy to apply them to where we are at as a church. And so we tend to be drawn to these letters because they're easy for us to understand. But as we look at them this morning, I want us to pull back a little bit. I want us to think about them in the context of the story of redemption, in the context of what God is doing as we've been walking through the Bible. And I want to ask you a question this morning. Is it easier to start something or to keep it going? Let me ask this way. Is it easier to start a family or raise a family? All right? For those who have business, is it easier to start a business or to keep the business going? Right? Thinking of the book of Acts, thinking of where we've been reading in Leviticus and Exodus, I mean, it was one thing for God to redeem Israel out of Egypt. It's a whole nother thing for Israel to continue to be the people of God, to be holy and to be set apart. When we went through the book of Acts last week, and I found it very fascinating, and I hadn't really seen this before. When you watch Paul go on his missionary journeys, what does he do on his first missionary journey? He plants churches. Everywhere he goes, every town he goes to, he plants churches. It's a church planting trip. The second journey, what does he do? Well, he starts out by visiting a number of the churches that he had planted the first time. So it's church care, and then he goes on to Macedonia and he plants a bunch more churches. By the time you come to the third journey, what does Paul do in the third journey? It's pretty much all church care. You could argue maybe he plants a church in Ephesus. I think there's probably already one there. But as you see Paul progress through his life, it goes from planting churches to caring for those churches. It's one thing to plant a church. It's another thing altogether to carry that church on, to keep that church growing. And as we come through the book of Acts, the question kind of we're left with at the end is the apostles aren't going to live forever. So how will the Holy Spirit, who began the work through the apostles, how will he continue it on after they are gone? Or to say it this way, how is this new church going to continue to live in the Spirit's power? And the answer to that question is the epistles, the 21 letters that we have in our Bible. Now, the overview here, an epistle simply means letter, Bill. It simply means letter. The epistles are letters. They're letters written from apostles or other church leaders to churches or individuals. How many are there? Well, technically speaking, there are 22. Technically, Revelation would be an epistle, but we set it aside and we're going to look at it separately. So we're going to look at the 21 epistles. Now, it's important for us to note that the apostles wrote far more than 21 letters. For instance, we know the Apostle Paul wrote at least 4 letters to the church at Corinth, but we only have 2 of them. We know the Apostle Paul wrote a letter to the church at Laodicea that we don't have. Okay, so the apostles wrote many letters. We don't have all of them. In the Spirit's wisdom and in the Spirit's sovereignty, he preserved 21 for us, that the Spirit inspired the apostles to write. The 21 that we have in our Bible are the 21 that the early church recognized as authoritative. Now, organizing, how are the epistles organized? This was actually helpful for me going through it here. The epistles are in a couple of subcategories, and in each category, they're simply arranged longest to shortest. Okay, so we could break the epistles down into 2 major subcategories: the Pauline epistles and the general epistles. Okay, now this is not deep waters. The Pauline epistles are called that because Paul wrote them. Okay, very good, very good. So they're there because Paul wrote them. So 13 of the epistles are written by Paul. Now, Paul's epistles are named according to the recipient. Okay, so they're named by who they're written to. So of the Pauline epistles, then there's 2 subcategories. There's the ones written to churches: Romans, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, 1st and 2nd Thessalonians. You'll notice, again, they're organized longest to shortest. Then Paul wrote some individual ones. He wrote 4 individual epistles, and they are 1st and 2nd Timothy, Titus, Philemon. Again, you'll notice longest to shortest. And then we have the general epistles. Now, the general epistles are written by someone other than Paul, okay? And the general epistles are named according to their author. Okay, so you'll notice when we come to there, the only exception to that is Hebrews, but they're James, 1st and 2nd Peter, 1st and 2nd, 3rd John, and Jude. Okay, so who wrote them? Peter, John, and Jude. Right, the only exception is the letter to the Hebrews. Why? Because we don't know who wrote that. And so it's named kind of for the recipients. It's written to the Hebrews. Okay, so it's helpful because you come, you're like James, and you hit Hebrews, and you're like, oh, is James before or after Hebrews? Well, James is shorter than Hebrews, so it comes after Hebrews, right? That's how they're organized in the Bible. Now, I gave you a chart. I'm not going to go through all of this in detail. We're not going to go through all 21 books of the New Testament. That's just beyond our ability to do that this morning. But I produced this chart just to try to be a helpful reference for you. You'll notice we have all 21 books listed on here, and they are listed in chronological order. Okay, that can be helpful when reading them because it helps you to know kind of where they land in the life of the early church. So the first column there is the author. And we have the author listed for all of the books of the New Testament. We are pretty confident about who the authors to the New Testament books are. I mean, some of them name the authors, so those are easy. We are confident, based on the testimony of the early church, that we know who wrote all the letters of the New Testament except for Hebrews. That's the one letter. We have no idea who wrote that letter. So that's what they can do. They can try to look at the language of the letter and try and say, well, but they can only compare it to somebody else who've written. And so some would like to say, well, the Apostle Paul wrote Hebrews. The problem is when you look at Paul's 13 letters and you look at Hebrews, the language doesn't really line up. Now, the Apostle Paul was a brilliant man. Is it possible that he could have? It's possible. Some would say, well, Peter wrote. Well, but we have 2 of Peter's writings, and Hebrews doesn't really match what Peter wrote. We say, well, John wrote it. Well, again, we can compare. It doesn't really line up. One of the interesting facts about it, though, is in the New Testament time period, there were many false teachers and false letters going around. Because as the apostles started to write letters, false teachers picked up on that and said, hey, I don't have to show up to spread my doctrine. I can just write a letter, sign Paul's name to it, and they're going to believe everything I say. And so that's why in Paul's letters, Paul emphasizes at times that he signed it with his own hand, that it was from him, right, as it goes out. So the interesting thing about Hebrews is that means it must have been written by somebody who was universally accepted in the early church. That's somebody that everybody knew that this person was a leader in the early church. For them not to sign it, for them not to put their name on it, it meant that clearly everybody knew who it was. Manuel?
He actually does say it in places that we
Who's that? The author. The author, yeah. So what that means, does it mean that he personally saw Christ as in one of the apostles, or like the Apostle Paul, who after the fact, we don't actually know, okay? I like to think, my guess is Apollos, but we have absolutely no idea. We just don't know who wrote it, and clearly the Spirit of God said we didn't need to know who wrote it. The book of Hebrews. Now, then I have the dates to the books. And you'll notice most of them, we can know for some certainty. The ones written before the close of Acts are easier to date. Why? Because we have the accounts of the book of Acts. And so we have an historical record that we can locate those books in. That if you'll notice on the back of your page, those are the epistles written after the book of Acts. And so those ones are harder to date because we don't have the historical narrative that we had in the book of Acts. So generally we know within a year or two when the books were written, and that can come sometimes from internal evidence based on Paul's missionary journeys and knowing where he was. Sometimes it can come from the standpoint of certain government officials are named in those letters, and we know in history when those government officials were reigned, and so we can roughly date when those books happened. Then we have the recipient. Again, we generally know who they were written to. The letters, for the most part, they tell us who they were written to. And so we have to the churches in the different cities, we have to the individuals, and then some are just more general, like Peter and John and Hebrews and Jude aren't necessarily to a single church, but seem to be to a broader audience. Then there's the place of writing. We know where some of them were written. Some of them we just don't know where they were written. Then we have the person who delivered them. Now, I think this is significant for, it's interesting just to note, but they didn't have a courier service. There was no FedEx, there was no Canada Post. And so if you wanted to write a letter, right, so the Apostle Paul writes a letter, and he knows that there's other people that are writing letters and signing his name to it. So who does Paul send his letter with? Somebody he trusts. Right? Somebody that the people would receive and know from him. So it's interesting when we read the list of names there in the deliverer, some of those names aren't very familiar with us, but we can know that those people were pretty prominent in the New Testament church. If the Apostle Paul, I got candy in here, it's kind of fading, isn't it? My voice. This morning's service may be short. The Apostle Paul clearly trusted these people. So someone like Tychicus, or we have Epaphroditus or Phoebe. These are people that the Apostle Paul would have trusted to take these letters to them. So they're also leaders in the early church. And then lastly, the last part of that column there is the reason for writing. So why did the Apostle Paul or Peter or John, why did they write? Writing letters was not cheap. Okay, we take writing for granted, right? Especially now with computers, there's so much written information. But writing letters was very expensive. In fact, and we have some of this evidence from some of the letters, often the apostles themselves would not write the letters, right? They would actually hire somebody to write the letter for them. And they would dictate to that person, and that person would write the letter down. Okay, so you have the cost of hiring somebody. You have the cost of the material itself, which was not cheap. Okay, and then you had the time that would be invested in putting all that together. So if they wrote a letter, clearly there's something important that they wanted to say. And so you have there in the column there why those letters were written in different ones. So I'm going to leave that with you. You can fold that in half, stick that in your Bible. It can help you as you are doing your Bible study, as you're reading various places in the Scriptures. What I want to do now is the category there is called Understanding the Epistles. And I want to give us three things that help us when we're reading any one of the epistles, three questions that if we answer will help us understand these letters in their proper context. Here's the challenge. Interpretation comes before application. What do I mean by that? When we read the Bible, we want to know what the original audience, what it meant to them before we apply it to us. So if we're going to get Corinthians correct, we need to understand the letter to the church at Corinth before we apply it to the church in Kincardine, right? And we need to make sure we understand that properly. Otherwise, we're going to misapply the text. So how can we assure that we understand that letter properly in its context? Well, the first thing we want to do is locate it in redemptive history, in God's story. Where does this letter fit in the Bible? Or where are we in redemptive history? Right? Again, God's got one plan of history here. So where do these letters fit in there? How do they fit in the overall plan of God? Well, where are we in redemptive history when we come to the epistles? Well, we come to the beginning of the church age. Remember last week, the book of Acts? We're starting the church. The church has just begun. Well, what does that mean? Well, a couple of key things that influence our understanding of the letters. So first is that means Jesus' death and resurrection has fulfilled the law's requirements. So the demands of the law are no longer on the people. Which means what? The people don't have to follow the law anymore. Now, there's still the law of God, but the Levitical law that we're reading in the book of Leviticus, now they no longer have to follow. And that's seen in the book of Acts. Remember when Peter, with the animals coming down, if you did your reading this morning, Leviticus 11, all these unclean animals, and what does God say to Peter? Rise and eat, right? They're clean. Okay, I mean, that's 2,000 some years of history that God's now saying, all right, we're gonna flip that, right? That's huge. So as Paul goes and he plants these churches, who does Paul start with? He starts with Jewish believers, right? So you have these Jews that have followed the law their whole life, and now we're throwing in Gentiles, which that was a huge no-no. That never happened. So now we have Jews and Gentiles mixed together, and they don't have to follow the law anymore. So the Jews are saying, well then, how do we live for God? Like, what does this look like then? I mean, all I had was the law. And the letters answer those questions. What does it mean? What does it look like for us to live for the Lord? Right? God is bringing those together. So what's important, the epistles don't change the Old Testament. They complete the Old Testament. Okay? The Old Testament was all the early church had. Okay, now they didn't have, every church didn't have a copy of the Old Testament, but that was what their framework was. Okay, so Jesus didn't show up and say, hey guys, you don't need to worry about that anymore, I'm here. No, what did Jesus come to do? He came to fulfill the law and prophets. So when Peter begins to preach and Paul begins to preach, they don't say, hey, forget all that stuff, guys. Like, we got some new revelation here. No, they say, this is going to help us understand the Old Testament. It's going to help us complete the picture of what God is doing. So the death and resurrection of Christ is huge and influences the church. The second thing is the Spirit of God now dwells in believers. And these believers are the ones who make up this new covenant community. So this is radically different than Israel. In the nation of Israel, the identity was a national identity, right? You were born into the nation of Israel. And as a male, you were circumcised the 8th day. You bore the sign of the covenant. When we come to the book of Romans, Paul talks about a circumcision of the flesh and a circumcision of the heart. And what he means by that is, although the nation was the Jewish nation, not everybody in that nation followed God. And so just because they were circumcised in the flesh, Paul says, does not mean that they were circumcised in the heart. And so what does that mean? You have the nation of Israel, but it's a mix of people who believe and people who don't believe. Even though they all have the sign of the covenant, it's a mixture of both. But when we come to the New Testament, when we come to the church, what happens now? That's no longer the case. Who bears the sign of the covenant? Well, first off, what is the sign of the new covenant? It's not circumcision anymore, but it's baptism. Baptism is the sign of the new covenant. Now, who receives the sign of the new covenant? All of those who have believed and repented. So you see the difference. Unlike Israel, the church, everyone in the church is to be believers. Everyone in the church bears the sign of the covenant. The covenant sign of all of those who are in. So again, you see this happening in the church. Now you have Jews and Gentiles. What have the Jews known? In a sense of identity, the Jews have known the law. The Jews have known the ritualistic practices of the nation. It's been a national identity. But now the church is no longer defined by nation. Now in the church, you have different ethnicities and different nationalities that are come together, but they all come together under what? Under the blood of Jesus Christ. And that's what brings them together. It's not the outward standard of a law anymore. It's something internal of the heart. Okay? Whew. So how do we live that out in the church? What does that look like? The epistles are the answer to that question. The epistles are helping us to work that out and understand who the church even is and then how they are to live. So locating it in redemptive history is tremendously helpful. The second thing we want to do is locate it in history, right? And this is in the world story. So where does this letter fit in history? Now, all the letters, all 21 letters, are written roughly within a 50-year time period. So we can, in this sense, we can locate them all to roughly the same time period in history. So what's happening at this time period in history? Who is the dominant power? Okay, Rome is the dominant power. Now, when we talk about this, I love Paul's words in Galatians chapter 4, verse 4, where Paul says, in the fullness of time, God sent forth his Son at exactly the right time. Listen here. So what are the elements of the first century that shaped the author and the recipients? Well, one of the huge things was called the Pax Romana. What's the Pax Romana? Well, let me read for you. I'm quoting here from a history website. The term Pax Romana, which literally means Roman peace, refers to the time period from 27 BC to 180 AD. This 200-year period saw unprecedented peace and economic prosperity throughout the empire, which spanned from England to north of Morocco to south in Iraq and in the east. During the Pax Romana, the Roman Empire reached its peak in terms of land area, and its population swelled to an estimated 70 million people. Nevertheless, Roman citizens were relatively secure, and the government generally maintained law and order and stability. The 200 years of the Pax Romana saw many advances and accomplishments, particularly in engineering and in arts. To help maintain their sprawling empire, the Romans built an extensive system of roads. These durable roads facilitated the movement of troops and communications. The Romans built aqueducts to carry water overland to cities and farms. So this is the world that the apostles grew up in and lived in. So this Pax Romana started about 30 years before Christ was born. So by the time we get to the New Testament area, we're right in the middle of this 200 years. So if we could use this term in a sense, there's a global peace. There's prosperity throughout the empire. There's these roads that connect all these cities. So travel through the empire has never been easier. They can go from place to place throughout the empire. With this peace, there was also a measure of religious freedom. The Romans didn't really care who you worshipped as long as you didn't get under their skin. And we see that there comes to be some persecution later on because that happens with Emperor Nero. But so there's this peace in the empire. The second thing that shapes the culture here is the Greek culture itself. The empire that preceded Rome was Greece, and Greece had successfully Greekanized the world. And so when the Romans came in, the Romans, very wisely, they didn't try to change that. The Roman language was Latin, but they didn't impose that on the people. They just went with Greek. And so the common language of the empire was Greek. Much like today with English, right? I mean, if you speak English today, there's not many places in the world you can't go and you'll be all right. That was the case in the New Testament time. Only the language wasn't English, the language was Greek. If you spoke Greek, you could go throughout the empire and everybody spoke Greek. So these elements shaped the history, the time period that we're in. So when you're reading a specific letter, it's helpful to understand this time period. For instance, we could read the book of Philippians, and we understand that in this time period, Philippi was a prominent city, and Philippi had come to the rescue of one of the Roman emperors, and as a result of that, the Roman Empire had bestowed upon the city of Philippi special privileges, so Roman citizenship. And so if you belonged to the city of Philippi, you were a citizen of Rome, and Roman citizenship was highly prized. As a result of that, many retired soldiers lived in the city of Philippi. So as Paul then writes to the church at Philippi, he says this in Romans 3:20, but our citizenship is in heaven. Now, who's he writing to? He's writing to people that greatly prize their earthly citizenship. They were Philippians. They were Romans. And Paul says, no, you are Christians. Your citizenship isn't here, it's somewhere else. Right? So helping us identify those areas. For instance, the city of Corinth was a thriving seaport in this time. It was a place known for its sinful indulgences. It was the sin city of that day and age. And so when you read that, when you read the letter to the church at Corinth, now you understand, wow, look at all the issues that are happening in the church. Well, when we consider the city that they're living in, we go, okay, this helps me to understand where they are. So how do you locate an individual letter in the time period it's written? Well, a good study Bible is going to help you do that. In the introduction, there'll be some paragraphs that will help you do that. The last is this. So we locate it in redemptive history, we locate it in world history, and then we locate it in the individual history of the recipient. So the question becomes, where are we in the life of this individual or in the life of this church? What's happening in this church that required a letter to be written at all? Why did Paul sit down and write a letter to the church at Corinth? Why did he write a letter to Timothy? Why did Peter write? That's what we're getting at, because that's going to help us then understand what's happening in the letter. For instance, in the church at Corinth, we know Paul is writing to address sin in the church. There's some sin that has happened in the church, and the church hasn't dealt with it. And Paul says, guys, what are you doing? But also in the letter to the church at Corinth, Paul is answering some questions. But the tricky part in 1 Corinthians is that often Paul doesn't state the question. He just gives his answer. So we don't exactly know what questions the church had, but that's what Paul's doing. So when you read the letter of Corinthians, at times it's like it abruptly changes subject. That's because Paul's going down the list and he's answering the questions that the church at Corinth had and bringing those together. The church at Thessalonians. Now this is an interesting letter because Paul had been in Thessalonica very briefly. He had not been there a very long time, and the church had been established, and Paul moves on from there, and he goes down to Corinth, and then he gets word that the church is doing well. Timothy had gone back, the church is growing, and the church greatly looked for the return of Christ. I mean, this church was excited for Jesus to come back. But then some of them begin to die in the church, and so there begins to get this concern in the church. Our brothers and sisters are going to miss out. Jesus is going to come back, and they're dead and gone. So Paul writes the letter of 1 Thessalonians to encourage them to say, you haven't missed out. You haven't missed out. Jesus is going to bring those with him. You don't need to be afraid. You don't need to be alarmed. Your faith does not need to be shaken. And it's a letter of encouragement. So again, we can go down through a letter to the Philippians, a letter to Timothy. When we understand what's happening in Timothy's life, Timothy is pastoring the church at Ephesus, okay? So picture this. Timothy, from what we know in Scripture, he's a timid guy. He's not the kind of take charge guy. He seemed to have some physical problems as well. So whether that was related to anxiety or whatever, we're not sure, but he seemed to have a weak constitution. The Apostle Paul planted the church at Ephesus. The Apostle Paul spent more time at the church in Ephesus than any other church. He was there for 3 years. Okay, so some of you guys have been doing the preacher's course said to me that, you feel a little, tense sometimes when you have to speak to Pastor Rob and, like he's the guru and then you have to preach to him. But put yourself in Timothy's shoes. Who's Timothy standing? He's standing in Paul's shoes. He's standing in the Apostle Paul's shoes to preach to the church at Ephesus. And not only that, we know later on that from early church history that the Apostle John ends up in Ephesus. So Timothy is in Paul's shoes preaching to who? The Apostle John is sitting in his audience. Do you think he's got some fear in there? Like, whoa. So what does Paul do? He writes to encourage Timothy. He writes to strengthen him, and he writes to give him instruction. So that as Timothy stands up and preaches to his church, it's saying, guys, look, this is what Paul said. This is what Paul gave instructions for. And so to encourage and help them organize the church. And so helping us to understand, again, a good study Bible is going to help you understand kind of the individual story and where those letters fit in. Now, any questions on that? Let's just back up. Give my voice a break. Any questions? Thoughts on that? So I didn't get here last week. We want to land the plane. Our theological points, God, man, and God's plan that we have kind of done with each lesson that we've gone through. And last week with the book of Acts, we said one of the challenges as we come into the book of Acts is that the apostles' framework was off. Do you remember that? They're thinking Messiah's coming, he's gonna deliver us politically, military, and Jesus was like, that's not really the plan. We're here to start the church, and we went to Ephesians 3, and this is something new. It's a mystery, right? And so as we come to the book of Acts, as we come to the epistles, we want to make sure our framework is right so that we understand it in the proper context. So how do we do that? Well, I think it's interesting, as we go through redemptive history, the prominent figure of the Godhead in the Old Testament is God the Father. And God the Father is his presence on Mount Sinai, and God the Father enters into marriage with Israel. Israel is his bride. And then we come to the Gospels, and who takes center stage? It's Jesus. And Jesus comes and he dies for our sins. But as we come to the book of Acts and the epistles, it's the Holy Spirit who steps to the forefront of redemptive history. And I was blown away by this, but the book of Acts contains more references to the Spirit of God than any other book in the Bible. It's the Spirit of God that now comes and infuses the people of God. And the epistles are where the Holy Spirit then takes the Word of God and illuminates it. So as we think about God, who are we thinking about here? We're thinking about God, the Holy Spirit. And the book of Acts testifies to what God can do through His Spirit through a people who are dependent on Him. When you read the book of Acts, and if you come away thinking, man, those people were really smart. Boy, those people really had it figured out. Then you've missed the point. When you read the book of Acts, you come to the book of Acts and you scratch your head and you're like, I don't know, how did this happen? How did that come together? Right? Then you read the epistles, and you're like, how on earth are we here today? How on earth did the church ever survive? I mean, with the sin, with the corruption, with the struggle, how did we ever get here? How did the gospel last long enough that it made all the way here to Kincardine, Ontario? And the answer to that is the Spirit of God. The Spirit of God moving and working amongst the people of God. See, the Acts of the Apostles and the Epistles, they're not a story of how a small group of people with a big vision accomplished much. It's not the story of human potential given enough time can do great things. It's the story of a Spirit-led, Spirit-empowered, Spirit-soaked church. That's what we see in the book of Acts. That's what we see in the epistles. As we read the epistles, the question we have is, will the church that the apostles planted, will it continue in the power of that same Spirit? And the ministry of the Spirit in the epistles is that of illumination, that the Spirit's going to take the Word of God and open up the Word of God to the people of God, and the Spirit of God is going to powerfully apply that Word to their lives. So we read the epistles and the power of the Spirit and seeing the Spirit of God. Secondly, man, we understand this from the epistles and the book of Acts. Man must depend on the Spirit of God if he is going to accomplish anything of eternal significance. Man can build buildings. Man can build organizations. Man can build nations. Okay, we see that evidenced all through world history. But if man is to do anything that lasts beyond this life, it can only be done in the power of the Spirit. The book of Acts stands out in redemptive history. Because as we go through the Old Testament, we see, God choosing people and God working through people, but it just never ends well, does it? With the nation of Israel, it just doesn't go well. It doesn't go well. It doesn't go well. And we finally come to the book of Acts, and it's like, it happens. Well, how does it happen? Does God finally find the right people? How did God actually do it? Man is so weak. Man is so sinful that the only way was that the Spirit of the living God had to literally reside in us in order to accomplish God's will. So that anything done, it is not us, but it's all about the Spirit. God can accomplish much through a people who are dependent upon Him. The epistles show us that the temptation of man in any age, though, is to depend on himself instead of on God's wisdom. And the apostles, through those letters, are warning and admonishing the church to remain pure in teaching and to remain pure in faith, because that is what the Spirit of God is going to use in His church. Then we see God's plan, and I love this in Scripture. The church is new. It's a mystery, but at the same time, it's not new. Yes, the church is new. It was a mystery in the Old Testament. The church was not there. It wasn't revealed to the prophets, but in a sense, no, the church is not new, and that God has always desired to redeem His people. So this is important for us. When we read the Bible, Israel was not God's plan A, and that failed, so then He went to plan B. No. God has one plan of redemption through Scripture, okay? And not a single part of that plan has failed. Every part of that plan has been successfully accomplished exactly as God desired, exactly as God wanted it to. So, on one sense, the church is different. The church is not Israel 2.0, okay? You don't just take everything from the Old Testament and apply it to the church. But the church is not new, and that the church is to fulfill the same purpose that Israel did. Listen to these two passages. Exodus 19 is where God makes his covenant with Israel. He says in verses 5 and 6, "Now therefore, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, you shall be my treasured possession among all peoples of the earth. You shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words that you shall speak to the people of Israel." Okay? Then we go to 1 Peter. Listen to what Peter says. He's speaking about the church now. "You are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people for his own possession, that you may proclaim the excellencies of him who called you out of darkness into his marvelous light." God has one plan through history, to redeem sinful mankind. Israel had a part in that plan. The church has a part in that plan. God's desire is still the same, to be known in all the earth. And the church of Jesus Christ is the means of him making that happen. We end off then with Jesus. And the epistles point us to Jesus. In the Old Testament, what did we have? In the Old Testament, we had the Messiah is coming, the Messiah is coming, the Messiah is coming, the Messiah is coming. And then in the Gospels, we had what? The Messiah came. And now the Messiah has a name. The name of Jesus. And so the message through the book of Acts and the epistles, in one sense, mirrors the Old Testament, but it's different in this. It has a name. And so the apostles stand before the Pharisees and they say what? There is salvation in no one else, for there's no other name under heaven given among men whereby you must be saved. God's plan is the same, but now we know who that plan is, and his name is Jesus. And the message of the church is not a generic message. The message of the church is extremely specific. The message of the church is Jesus Christ. And I don't have time this morning. Our time is done. But I went through every one of the epistles. And in every single one of the epistles, you can see where Christ is central in those epistles. If you were to take Christ out of the epistles, then we don't have the epistles anymore. Jesus is central. And the success of a church is directly dependent on keeping Christ central. And so we could summarize the 21 epistles this way. What are the apostles trying to do? They're trying to keep the church, warn the church, admonish the church that Jesus must be central. And if Jesus is central and Jesus is honored, God will be glorified and he will be able to accomplish his plan. So here we are, 2,000 years later, Bill. And what's our desire this morning? We want to lift high the name of Jesus Christ this morning. We want to honor Christ this morning. We want him to be central in our lives and central in our church, that the Spirit of God would be able to move and work amongst his people for his glory. Do we have anything special here? No. But do we have the Spirit of God? Yes. And our prayer is that the Spirit of God would move and work. Let me pray for us. Father, thank you for this morning. Thank you. So gracious that you gave us these 21 letters that we can learn from and grow from. And God, our prayer is simple this morning, that Jesus would be first, that Jesus would be central, and that the Spirit of God would empower your people today. And the Spirit of God would open up the Word of God so that we might see it and know it. And the Spirit of God would move upon your people to live out that Word in this world that we live in. Father, there's no other name under heaven given among men whereby we must be saved. May we be faithful to proclaim his name this day. In Jesus' name, amen. Amen.